When you think of French emperors, what comes to mind first? Napoleon charging across Europe, golden palaces dripping with wealth, maybe a crown so heavy it could snap your neck? Well, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what these so-called great men were doing behind the scenes when no one was writing the official history? Would you trust a ruler who bathed less than once a month? Or one who stuffed himself at feasts until he nearly burst? How about an emperor whose diplomacy was nothing more than chasing lovers around Versailles? Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But this wasn't comedy, it was the daily routine of the men running France. History books love to glorify French engineering, conquests and revolutions. Yet rarely do they mention the disgusting, filthy and downright absurd habits that warped the empire itself. And let's be honest, doesn't it make you just a little curious? If power corrupts, wait until you see what unlimited wine, arrogance and perfume did to these emperors. So, are you ready to meet the men who shaped Europe with one hand, while the other was busy making a mess of themselves? Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as the military genius who reshaped Europe, but behind the polished portraits and marble statues lived a man with habits as revolting as they were ridiculous. For one, hygiene was not his strong suit. He bathed rarely, preferring to mask his scent with perfume and cologne. Letters to his wife Josephine reveal he often told her not to wash before he returned from campaign. Apparently, he enjoyed things as natural as possible. Romantic? Hardly. More like nauseating. At the table, Napoleon wasn't much better. His meals were fast, messy, and enormous, often devouring plates of roasted meat and pastries in minutes. He chewed with his mouth open, spilling food across the table like a soldier raiding rations. For a man who demanded precision on the battlefield, he showed none when it came to eating. Servants dreaded his dinners, not because of politics, but because of the chaos left behind on the floor and tablecloths. Then there was his temper. Napoleon was famous for explosive outbursts, screaming at generals and ministers like a spoiled child denied dessert. The same man who crowned himself Emperor of France once stomped around like an irritable toddler, red-faced and dripping sweat. Combine that with his notorious egomania, he literally placed the crown on his own head instead of letting the Pope do it, and you get a man consumed by his own myth. But perhaps the most disgusting detail was his obsession with control, extending even to his bedroom. His affairs were numerous, his appetites insatiable, and his approach often clumsy. Courtiers whispered about his lack of manners in private moments, something far from the image of the great conqueror. History remembers him for strategy and empire building, but day to day Napoleon was more pigsty than palace. And if you thought Napoleon's dirty habits were bad, wait until you meet his nephew. Luxury made him even filthier. If Napoleon built an empire with cannons, his nephew Napoleon III tried to build one with curtains, chandeliers, and an endless parade of mistresses. Rising to power in 1852, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte styled himself as the modern emperor, but behind the polished speeches and carefully waxed mustache, his habits were anything but refined. Let's start with his obsession with appearance. Napoleon III spent outrageous sums redecorating palaces, surrounding himself with velvet, marble, and gilded toilets that gleamed brighter than his political credibility. Paris became his personal stage, and he rebuilt the city into wide boulevards not just for style, but also so cannons could easily crush revolts. Nothing says romantic Paris like an emperor who redesigned the capital with riot control in mind. Then there were his appetites, political and personal. He devoured food with the same energy he devoted to chasing lovers across Europe. Gossip columns of the time joked that he had more mistresses than soldiers in his guard, and his affairs were hardly discreet. Courtiers whispered about his late-night escapades, while his wife, Empress Eugénie, endured his humiliations with forced dignity. If Napoleon III liked his women natural, Napoleon III simply liked them numerous. His vanity extended into absurdity. He loved dressing up in elaborate uniforms, strutting around like a toy soldier, even when he hadn't seen a real battle in years. On the rare occasions he did command in war, his lack of strategy led to catastrophic defeats like the disaster at Sedan in 1870 that ended his reign. Imagine, a man more skilled at arranging banquets than battle formations leading France into humiliation. So while his uncle left behind legends of conquest, Napoleon III left a legacy of scandal sheets, empty stomachs, and broken dreams. His disgusting habits weren't just personal, they seeped into the very politics of France, turning the empire into a farce wrapped in velvet. And if Napoleon III drowned in perfumes and mistresses, wait until you meet Louis XIV. He turned bad hygiene into a royal lifestyle. Louis XIV is remembered as the dazzling Sun King, the monarch who turned Versailles into the most magnificent palace in Europe. But behind the mirrors, fountains, and golden halls lay a daily routine so revolting that even the poorest peasants might have turned up their noses. If Napoleon III drowned in perfumes, Louis XIV barely bothered to wash at all. Bathing, in his view, was a dangerous activity that could weaken the body. The result? A ruler who stank as much as he shone. Court life at Versailles was an endless parade of filth, dressed in silk. Imagine hundreds of courtiers crammed into gilded halls with no proper toilets. Buckets overflowed, corridors stank, and the smell of sweat and unwashed wigs lingered like a fog. Louis himself was no exception. He masked his odor with heavy colognes, turning his royal presence into an assault on the senses. To kiss the king's hand was not just a privilege, it was a test of survival. His eating habits were no less grotesque. Louis loved enormous banquets where he devoured mountains of meat, sweets, and wine while being watched by dozens of courtiers. Food often spilled down his lavish clothes, and he thought nothing of burping loudly in public. The Sun King's table manners were as blindingly bad as the chandeliers above him. Then there was his endless appetite for women. Mistresses were paraded in and out of Versailles like fashion accessories, each competing for royal attention. For Louis, lust was a daily ritual as ordinary as signing decrees. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a gilded playground for excess, gossip, and scandal. So while history books glorify his golden reign, the truth is that Louis XIV's habits were as disgusting as they were legendary. Behind the sunlight, there was always a stench. And if you thought the Sun King's filth was dazzling enough, Louis XIV will prove that lust and decay could shine even brighter. If Louis XIV made Versailles stink of sweat and perfume, his successor Louis XV managed to make it smell even worse, with scandal. Nicknamed Louis the Beloved early in his reign, he quickly became more notorious for his bedroom than his throne. While France slid toward crisis, Louis XV devoted himself to women, wine, and whispered gossip, treating his empire like a private pleasure garden. Let's start with his infamous Parc aux Cerfs, a secret harem hidden in Versailles. Young girls were brought in to entertain the king, many of them barely past childhood. For Louis, this wasn't shameful, it was a lifestyle. While the people of France struggled to afford bread, their ruler spent fortunes on keeping his own appetites satisfied. The contrast between starving peasants and the king's personal playground couldn't have been more grotesque. His eating habits were hardly better. Like his great-grandfather, Louis XV adored lavish banquets where he stuffed himself with endless courses. He drank wine as if it were water and ate so greedily that courtiers often whispered he was more beast than monarch. If Louis XIV was a glutton for grandeur, Louis XV was a glutton in the literal sense. And let's not forget his laziness. Unlike Napoleon or even Louis XIV, Louis XV showed little interest in governing. He preferred hunting, gambling, and lounging with mistresses, leaving ministers to manage the collapsing state. His reign became a symbol of excess and decay, setting the stage for the bloody revolution that would soon sweep France. Louis XV's habits weren't just disgusting, they were fatal. His unchecked lust, greed, and apathy drained the dignity from the monarchy, leaving behind nothing but resentment. By the time he died, the beloved was anything but. And if you thought Louis XV's debauchery was the peak of royal rot, wait until Louis XV arrives. His obsession with locks and negligence will make you wonder how France even survived. By the way, tell us in the comments, whose habit so far made you gag the most? Napoleon's filth, Louis XIV's stench, or Louis XV's scandals? Louis XV is remembered less for his ruling and more for losing his head, literally. But before the guillotine claimed him, his personal habits revealed a man utterly unfit for the throne. While the people of France cried out for bread, Louis was busy tinkering with locks and keys, indulging a bizarre obsession that made him look more like a hobbyist locksmith than a king. Imagine an empire collapsing around you, and the monarch is in the workshop polishing hinges. His diet didn't help his reputation. Louis XVI loved heavy meals, eating to excess even as famine gripped the countryside. He consumed enormous portions of meat, cheese, and pastries, washing it all down with tankards of wine. The king's stomach was always full while his subjects were empty, a grotesque picture of indulgence. And let's just say his table manners weren't much better than his ancestors. He ate like a man who believed royal dignity ended once the food arrived. Then there was his complete lack of charisma. Where Louis XIV commanded presence and Louis XV commanded gossip, Louis XVI commanded yawns. He was awkward, shy, and painfully indecisive, unable to carry himself as a figure of power. His clumsy speeches and stammering demeanor turned him into a target of ridicule. The court mocked him, the people despised him, and even his own wife, Marie Antoinette, overshadowed him in the scandal department. What sealed his fate wasn't just politics, but the grotesque contrast between his personal life and his people's misery. He tinkered with keys while revolutionaries sharpened blades. By the time he realized the danger, it was far too late. His disgusting blend of gluttony, apathy, and incompetence turned the monarchy into a laughingstock, and then into a bloodbath. If Louis XVI seemed hopelessly distracted, wait until Louis XVI. His gluttony was so legendary it almost made Versailles look like a diet camp. If Louis XVI lost his head, his brother Louis XIII nearly lost his entire body to food. By the time he took the throne in 1814, he was already so overweight that courtiers whispered he looked more like a stuffed goose than a king. His habits of gluttony were legendary. He ate until he wheezed, devouring trays of pastries, roasted meats, and rich sauces that stained his embroidered coats. His bedchamber smelled less like perfume and more like a butcher's kitchen, but the real spectacle was watching him try to move. Louis XVIII suffered from gout, obesity, and a variety of ailments made worse by his own excess. Servants often had to carry him from room to room, and it became an open joke at court that the king had turned himself into his own royal furniture. Dignity was not his strong suit. Imagine the supposed leader of France huffing and puffing just to climb into a carriage. Despite the decay of his body, his appetite for gossip and manipulation remained sharp. He surrounded himself with flatterers, feasted while France struggled to rebuild after Napoleon's wars, and pretended that endless banquets could restore royal prestige. Instead, they only made the monarchy look grotesque, bloated, and hopelessly out of touch. Louis XVIII's reign is rarely remembered for great reforms or triumphs. Instead, it is remembered for his size, his stench, and his table. He was living proof that sometimes history is shaped not by grand decisions, but by greasy fingers and too many desserts. And if you thought Louis XVIII ate like there was no tomorrow, Charles VI will show you what happens when madness takes the throne. By the way, let us know in the comments which emperor disgusted you more so far, the locksmith King Louis XVI or the glutton Louis XVIII. If gluttony and laziness could rot a monarchy, madness could tear it apart completely, and Charles II proved it. Nicknamed Charles the Mad, he ruled France from 1380 to 1422, though ruled might be too generous. His reign was marked by bizarre habits that turned him into both a tragedy and a grotesque spectacle. Charles suffered from fits of insanity so severe that he sometimes failed to recognize his own family. On one infamous occasion, he attacked his own knights in a frenzy, slaughtering several of them before collapsing in exhaustion. The court whispered about demons, curses, and poisoned bloodlines, but one of his most absurd obsessions became legendary. Charles believed he was made of glass. He walked cautiously, wrapped himself in padded clothes, and forbade anyone from touching him for fear of shattering. Imagine an emperor of France waddling through palaces like a fragile wine glass. His hygiene habits weren't much better. During his long bouts of illness, Charles often refused to bathe or change clothes, letting filth accumulate on his body and in his chambers. Servants dreaded entering his rooms, where the stench was said to rival the plague pits. Yet, this was the man expected to command armies during the 100 Years' War. Instead, France was ruled by a fragile madman who preferred hiding in padded robes. The effects were catastrophic. With a king so incapacitated, France descended into political chaos. Nobles schemed, foreign enemies invaded, and the monarchy's prestige crumbled. Charles II wasn't just a king with bad habits. He was a disaster, wrapped in velvet and paranoia. His reign showed that madness at the top spreads rot all the way down. And if Charles VI's glass delusion left you shaking your head, wait until you hear about Philip V. His habits were less explosive, but every bit as bizarre. Philip V may have been born a Bourbon Prince of France before becoming King of Spain, but his habits were every bit as grotesque as those of his French cousins. If Charles VI thought he was made of glass, Philip V acted like he was made of fog, listless, unstable, and consumed by strange obsessions that turned his court into a madhouse. One of his most revolting habits was refusing to change clothes for weeks at a time. He would wear the same filthy garments until they reeked, insisting that new clothes drained his energy. Courtiers often had to sneak clean outfits into his chambers just to keep him from smelling like a corpse. Add to that his refusal to cut his hair or nails, and you have a monarch who looked less like a king and more like a wandering beggar who stumbled into a palace. Then there were his bizarre routines. Philip often stayed in bed for days, neglecting affairs of state while obsessively plucking at his clothes or staring into space. He was so paranoid about death that he sometimes refused to touch objects for fear of being poisoned. Meals became awkward ceremonies where he barely ate, muttering prayers and superstitions while servants looked on nervously. His court life collapsed into farce. Ministers struggled to coax him into basic duties, while foreign diplomats mocked his incapacity. Spain, under his reign, was led by a man who often preferred the comfort of his bedclothes to the responsibilities of a crown. Far from majestic, Philip V embodied a monarchy reduced to superstition, stench, and despair. Philip's habits were not just disgusting, they were contagious. His melancholy set the tone for his household, leaving the empire weak and unstable. If Louis XIV built Versailles as a golden cage, Philip V turned Madrid into a padded cell. And if Philip V's filth and paranoia weren't enough, Francis II will show you how weakness and obsession can drag an empire to its knees. Tell us in the comments, would you rather live under a king who thought he was made of glass, or one who smelled like a grave? Francis II may have been the last Holy Roman Emperor, but his habits were anything but holy. Crowned in 1792, he presided over the final collapse of an empire that had stood for centuries, and his personal quirks were a perfect reflection of that decay. Unlike Napoleon, who conquered Europe with cannon fire, Francis conquered nothing, except perhaps the art of being weak, rigid, and obsessively routine. One of his most revolting traits was his obsession with cleanliness, not the kind that makes you tidy, but the kind that borders on mania. He insisted on endless hand-washing rituals, sometimes scrubbing until his skin cracked, convinced that filth and disease lurked in every corner. Yet ironically, he often let his clothes rot on his body for days, reeking of sweat beneath perfumed layers. It was a bizarre mixture of paranoia and negligence, leaving courtiers to whisper about his contradictions. His meals were as strange as his habits. Francis ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite with the focus of a man conducting diplomacy at the table. But while he obsessed over neatness, he gorged himself on fatty meats and cream sauces, leaving stains on the elaborate uniforms he wore obsessively, even when they no longer fit. The emperor's appearance was often as bloated as his empire's bureaucracy. More troubling was his mental rigidity. Francis detested change and clung to outdated rituals even as Europe erupted around him. While Napoleon restructured nations, Francis hid behind dusty traditions and repetitive ceremonies. His paranoia grew so strong that he refused to meet people without layers of protocol, turning the empire's court into a suffocating theater of fear. In the end, Francis II's disgusting mix of paranoia, weakness, and stale routines didn't just mark his personal downfall, it symbolized the death of an entire empire. He was less a ruler than a relic, preserved in mothballs while history swept past him. And if Francis II seemed stale and paranoid, wait until you meet Napoleon II, the so-called King of Rome, whose wasted life was as tragic as it was grotesque. Napoleon II, often called the King of Rome, is one of history's strangest emperors, mostly because he never really ruled. Born the son of Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria, his very existence was meant to symbolize the continuation of a dynasty. Instead, he became a living ghost, raised in luxury, but smothered by obsessions and habits that made his short life as grotesque as it was tragic. From the start, Napoleon II lived in isolation. Kept at the Austrian court, he grew up surrounded by stiff rituals, strict tutors, and endless reminders that he was an emperor without an empire. Instead of commanding armies, he spent long hours locked in his chambers, developing an obsession with order and cleanliness. Servants whispered that he would rearrange furniture compulsively and polish objects until his hands blistered, as if trying to shine away the shame of his father's downfall. His health was fragile, and his routines only made matters worse. Napoleon II ate poorly, favoring sweets and heavy foods that left him weak and sickly. He often skipped exercise, spending more time staring at books or pacing rooms than building strength. By his late teens, tuberculosis had hollowed him out, yet he continued to indulge in heavy meals and cloistered habits. His chamber smelled of medicines, sweat, and spoiled food, a sad parody of imperial dignity. Perhaps most revolting of all was the emptiness of his life. Courtiers noted how he would obsess over ceremonial uniforms, trying them on in front of mirrors, parading as if he commanded legions that no longer existed. The King of Rome was less a ruler and more a costumed mannequin, a young man trapped by titles he could never live up to. Napoleon II died at just 21, not in battle or revolution, but coughing in a darkened palace room, surrounded by the suffocating habits that wasted his life. His story is less about power abused than about potential rotting away behind closed doors. And if Napoleon II's tragic decay wasn't grotesque enough, wait until we return to the mighty Charlemagne, whose odd habits helped build an empire. Tell us in the comments which story shocked you more, Francis II's paranoia or Napoleon II's wasted life. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, is often celebrated as the father of Europe, the mighty emperor who united much of the continent under his banner. But behind the legends of crowned glory and endless conquests, his daily habits were far less majestic. In fact, some of them were downright revolting. If Napoleon II wasted away in isolation, Charlemagne thrived, but in ways that would make modern audiences gag. Let's start with his eating. Charlemagne adored food, especially roasted meats, and he devoured them in quantities that would shock even the greediest banquet-goer. He ate with his hands, tore through joints of meat, and was notorious for belching loudly in front of guests. Wine flowed like water, and by the end of a meal, the emperor looked more like a satiated barbarian than a divine ruler. The father of Europe also left plenty for servants to clean up. Scraps, bones, and grease splattered across the royal tables. Then there was his attitude toward relationships. Charlemagne took multiple wives and countless concubines, fathering an astonishing number of children across the empire. For a man tasked with uniting Europe under order and faith, he treated marriage more like a rotating hobby than a sacred duty. His mistresses paraded through court with little subtlety, and his appetite for flesh rivaled his appetite for food. Even his hygiene left much to be desired. While he was said to enjoy swimming, he often did so with a swarm of courtiers, turning bathhouses into chaotic soup pots of sweat, grime, and chatter. Imagine an emperor trying to hold court policy discussions while floating in murky bathwater, surrounded by half the nobility. Hardly the shining image of imperial discipline. Charlemagne may have built the foundations of European power, but he did so with grease on his fingers, mistresses at his side, and very little refinement. His greatness was undeniable, but so were his grotesque habits. The man who shaped Europe was also the man who feasted, belched, and indulged his way through history. And if Charlemagne's habits showed how even greatness can be filthy, wait until the conclusion. We'll tie together how all these emperors warped history with their disgusting routines. From Napoleon's filthy love letters to Louis XV's private harem, from Charles VI's glass-body delusion to Charlemagne's greasy banquets, the story of France's emperors is not one of pure glory, it's one of revolting habits that shaped history in the most grotesque ways. Behind the crowns, scepters, and polished portraits were men who sweated, stank, stuffed themselves, and indulged in obsessions that warped empires as surely as any war. And yet that's precisely what makes them unforgettable. Power, when mixed with arrogance and unchecked appetites, produces not legends of virtue but legends of vice. These emperors were not marble statues, they were flesh and blood, and that flesh was often sweaty, bloated, and reeking of excess. So the next time history books glorify the grandeur of French leadership, remember what we've uncovered here. An empire not just of conquest and culture, but of dirty bedrooms, chaotic feasts, and rulers who mistook indulgence for greatness. History is never as clean as it looks in paintings. Sometimes it's greasy fingers, broken locks, and madness wrapped in velvet. And maybe that's the real lesson. Power reveals in the end just how disgusting people can be.